What's up, guys? It's Bromley from Empire Barbell, and today we're going to talk about the Sumo Deadlift. Now, real quick, before I get into it, I just want to talk about the forum we started, empire-forum.com. We're trying to build a big community there so you can take all of your questions and ideas that relate to these videos, take them over there, post them, and we can have a more in-depth discussion than the YouTube comment section will allow us to have. There's also places to post training videos, to keep a training log, to have general discussions about pretty much whatever you like. So link is in the description. In the future, we're going to charge for it, a couple bucks a month. For now, it's free, and it will continue to be free for you if you did sign up before we started charging for membership. So if you sign up now, it'll be free forever. So getting into the Sumo Deadlift. Now, this is one of my favorite things to rant about. I almost made this I hate Sumo Deadlift video just for the controversy, but I decided to take a more serious, in-depth look at the Sumo Deadlift and where it kind of fits into a general training program. So first things first, can somebody call PC principle? Because I'm pretty sure that's cultural appropriation. Of course, we call it the Sumo Deadlift, and the wide stance squats used to be called sumo squats, but you don't hear that thrown around quite as much anymore. Sumo basically just means you're taking a super wide stance, similar to a sumo wrestler. The wider stance, if we're comparing these two guys, I tried to draw them with similar leverages. The wider stance does a couple of things. You see, it allows the lifter to be completely upright. Hips stay more under the shoulders. The elbows, the arms are inside the knees as opposed to outside of the knees. And because the knees are to the outside, you have this wedge that's created. So if I turn my knee out to the side, the front to back distance of your hip to femur, it shortens a little bit. So the hips stay really close to the bar. So that's much better leverages. I mean, leverages are simply how far away is the load from the pivot point. Over here, the load is the barbell, the main pivot point's the hips. That front to back distance means worse leverages. So getting your hips in really close means better leverages. Now your knees are also out of the way, so as you kind of push the ground away, the bar gets to stay closer to your hips throughout the entire range, where with a conventional deadlift, you have to clear the knee before you can really drag that bar back to you and bring your hips forward and completing the lift. So mechanically, and this is where a lot of you miss with your deadlift, mechanically you're so much stronger above the knee. You should never be missing a deadlift above the knee. That means your setup really sucks, so you're in a crappy position by the time you're at your knee. Or it means you just never really dialed in that habit of bringing your hips through. You never want to think of pulling up. You want to think of pushing your hips into the bar. So that should always be explosive. It should be very quick as you shove your hips out to complete a conventional deadlift. As you develop your lift and as you grow over a period of time, that should be your strongest phase. So if you're missing right there, it means you haven't been doing your due diligence, treating yourself as a technical deadlifter. It means you have a lot to clean up with your setup. Now, why is there controversy around the Sumo Deadlift? Why do so many people hate on the Sumo Deadlift? Well, there's two ways to evaluate a lift. You can evaluate a lift as a feat of strength, which is what powerlifting started as, what I would argue it's supposed to be. Or you can look at a movement and you can assess it as a developmental tool. Now, the interesting thing about powerlifting is it hasn't been around very long. Olympic lifting started late 1800s, or like the early kind of iterations of Olympic lifting. Powerlifting didn't start until 1965. So through the 40s, 50s, 60s, those movements were main developmental exercises for people who are part of physique culture. People are so used to nowadays treating those movements as competitive exercises that they really lose sight of the fact that squats, benches, deadlifts used to be what people did just to get bigger and then subsequently get stronger. So if we're evaluating a sumo deadlift developmentally, let's pick that apart first. This upright position with the feet out wide to the side, what does this mirror? That mirrors more of a squatting position. Because you're upright, you're not hinging as much, okay? The main pivot isn't necessarily going to be the knee. It's going to be more, isn't going to be the hip. It's going to be distributed much more into the knee. So by staying upright with your knees out, you're almost like a scissor jack. And you get to just push your knees out. Your hips are already into the bar. So it's more like the top half of the squat. And people who are very built for this movement, they can get into a really tight, comfortable position, and the range of motion is really abbreviated, but it's not even the range, it's the leverage advantage you get by having a certain build. So what's going on here? With the knee out wide to the side, the glutes are gonna start contracted. It's one of the main things that the glute does is abduction, taking the knee out to the side. So anytime you do wide stance anything, you might notice that you're a little more sore in the glutes because they're getting used a little bit more than normal. So for general glute development, the Sumo Deadlift does quite a bit to get the glutes engaged. So if that's a weak point for you, if you're trying to isolate, put more I guess, emphasis onto the glutes specifically, or maybe the glutes as it pertains to your lockout strength, Sumo Deadlifts are a good option. Because it rounds you out, I mean, it's similar to going wider in a bench versus narrow. By adding in that variety, you might be able to get a little more well-rounded. You might be able to round out some rough edges and make your deadlift a little more complete. Now, one of the big things that limits the Sumo Deadlift, that limits people when it comes to Sumo Deadlifting, is their build. If we're looking at it as a feat of strength, I think the Sumo Deadlift falls short, and a lot of people tend to agree, which is why they're controversy to begin with. It's one thing to have a strength sport that selects for the best possible technique. That's a good example is Olympic lifting. There's a variety of techniques you can use, but you have to be very, very technical, very, very dialed in no matter what you do. And ultimately, it's kind of a wash among everybody, so then it comes down to strength and physical ability. With Sumo Deadlifting, it favors a small percentage of the population. It doesn't just select for a technique, it selects for leverages that are favorable to that technique. And you look at these people that have a similar anthropomorphy, their arms and leg ratios to their torso, it's similar. And what that ends up with is a very strong position. So right here, the hip is going to be above the knee in the sumo stance, and you're going to be upright with your hands still able to get to the bar. Now, some of you might try to get into a sumo position and realize that to get into the bar, you still have to be bent over. For me to get into this position, my hips actually end up below parallel. I'm not built well for sumo. I have long torso, short arms. I have to bend over a little more, and my hips still end up in a below parallel squat, which is a very, very weak starting position. So the best sumo pullers, they're gonna be able to get their legs out very wide. Their knee and hip angle is still gonna be open. That means more than 90 degrees. And they're gonna be able to start very upright. So whatever combination of limb leverages allows you to really get into this position, that's gonna be what Sumo Deadlifting selects for. That's who's gonna pull the biggest weight sumo. Now, on top of leverages, just how long your arms and legs are relative to each other, relative to your torso, we also got to talk about hip shape. Some people, their hips just don't point out to the side. Mine actually point very forward. So you look at people that, let's say, can squat very wide and their knees can still end up right over their feet. It's not just mobility. Some people have hips that are shaped that if you take your femurs out too far, you run into bone. You're limited with how far you can get it out, get your knees out to the side. Because the more closer your feet are together, the more forward your knees are going to be, which means the more front and back distance you're going to have right here, which is going to kill your leverages. So we're not just talking about favoring these limb ratios, we're talking about favoring a certain pelvic position as well, a certain type of pelvic design. So with powerlifting, we have kind of the spirit of the sport. Now, this is something that's unique to strength culture. I've talked about this a little bit before. Most sports, they have a spirit of the sport and they make rules, they evolve over time to keep that spirit alive, because the athletes and the coaches are always going to try to be opportunists. They're always going to try to bump up against the rules as much as they can to get the desired result, which is to win. Powerlifting is so different. On a bench press, your shoulders and butt, sometimes your head, all have to be in contact with the bench, but it doesn't say anything about the space in between. So you get lifters that get very, very, very high arches and very wide grip, and they end up moving the bar that far. There are some people who are very notorious examples, not just for getting a contortionist arch, but for literally getting the range of motion on their bench down within 2 inches. Most people look at that and say, that's not what we're trying to do here, guys. There should be some emphasis on completing a feat of strength to some easily definable standard, but it's not easily definable, which is why we run into trouble. So the question is, are the powers that be going to change the rules, come up with creative ways to prevent that extreme opportunistic approach from taking over? Or are we just going to accept that, hey, it's within the confines of the rules? Similarly, a lot of people will look at people who are very, very built to pull sumo, and they might be unimpressed by what they see. They might look at somebody who sets up at the bar with their feet almost touching the plates and who lock the barbell out on their kneecaps and say, yeah, that's not really the same thing. I tend to be in that camp. There's a movement in strength sports, not only to ignore what the spirit of the sport is or should be, to just arbitrarily give in to the rules and say, well, it's within the rules, it counts. But if you suggest otherwise, it's almost like you're just a big meanie who's trying to invalidate somebody else's performance. There is no amount of argument that is going to convince me that we should treat a conventional deadlift the same as a sumo deadlift. They're two different movements, period. The setup is different, not just from, hands inside, feet out wide. The fact that you're so upright. I mean, part of the beauty of the big three, it's why they started anyways as developmental exercises. They were the three big developmental exercises. A squat is a squat type movement. It's a deep knee bend. A deadlift is a hinge. Hips are back. The strength and development required to be very strong in a hinge type movement, it kind of counters, it supplements a squat. So by taking that out, by getting the feet wide, by starting upright, it seems like we're kind of going against that original design to have three movements that kind of test your whole body. So that's one. Some of you might not find that very compelling, and that's fine. I do. I think the strength and development required to build a big conventional deadlift is unique. I think it should be tested on its own. The deadlift is one event in powerlifting. The pounds you pull sumo count as the same the pounds you pull conventional, even though they're wildly different lifts. Now, I know what you're thinking. I'm a strong man. It's the Wild West. We have pretty much no rules about technique. Now, that's not entirely true. We just value different things. In strongman, the goal is always to get things from point A to point B, but point B is clearly defined. On an overhead press, you can absolutely jerk your overhead press, or you can strict press it. Now, clearly, you can move more weight in a jerk than you can with a strict press, as long as you're developed and experienced enough. But point B is the same. If you end up with your feet split or your feet very wide, you have to walk them back in. So the point is to get to this locked out, head forward, elbows locked, feet together position any way possible. And athletes get creative and they find all the different ways, and some things that are good for a bar might not be good for a log, which might not be good for a sandbag or a stone or a dumbbell. So you have to get creative and you have to have a wide array of techniques in your belt, and that lends itself to the variety of the sport. It's why the sport's so unique. In powerlifting, the start and the finish aren't clearly defined. Even in bench pressing, you can't take your hands all the way out to the collars. You have to be touching the ring. So there's people that will even try to game the system to try and cock their wrists out so that their fingers touching, but their wrist is another inch or two out to the side to try and get a wider press path. So even in that way, powerlifting has adapted the rules to try to prevent opportunists from, doing the shortest possible range of motion that they could get away with. So it really makes no sense to me why there wouldn't be some limit on how wide your feet are set, because standing up with your feet together fully erect is night and day from standing up fully erect with your feet 3.5 feet apart. Now, part of the beauty of sports, well, one of the reasons I'm going to have a ball with this subject is because this is opinion. It's subjective, so you can't prove me wrong. Now, I'm going to really enjoy the comments thread where a lot of you try to do so anyways, but this is opinion. It's not something I can prove objectively. I can just make my case and tell you how I connect the dots. Now, since we're going the strongman route, using that is kind of an analog for how we think about some of these things, because strongman is a lot more varied. Strongman is the Wild West. You can do virtually anything. If the course is mapped out, you got to get something from point A to point B. Usually how you get there, it's a free-for-all. You can get creative with your solutions. Strongman allows just about everything, but it doesn't allow sumo. So that should tell you something about the developmental process of creating rules for sport that go into determining how you compare like feats of strength. Now, to be fair, there's also a lot of other lifts I don't care about and I'm not impressed with. I don't care about Jefferson deadlifts. I don't care about Zurcher deadlifts. They might be fun little one-off things that you do in training to try and switch it up, or to say, hey, let's see what I can do this way. But they're not standardized. And I would argue they probably shouldn't be. There's weird little sects of powerlifting organizations that you'll find in the Midwest where like 10 guys get in a room and they, try to do a fucking Arthur lift where they do a clean behind the back. You've seen some of these guys around. They usually represent the lowest common denominator of lifting culture. They're usually people that aren't super involved or super concerned with physical development, with taking themselves as far as they can go and standardized feats. Part of the reason people get, I think, pulled into these weird subsets of lifting is because it's easier to stand out if you're a big fish in a small pond. So if you just, if you just niche down, an inch wide and a mile deep, you're going to find that you're not in really dense company. So it's easier to stand out. And I have a problem with that. I think you sell yourself short. You get to say that you enjoy lifting, you benefit all the things from lifting. One of the most valuable things about lifting is the journey you go on. I mean, it's getting to the bottom of the mountain with no idea of how you're going to scale it. And every inch that you climb, you realize you might not ever get to the top, but every inch you climb, you realize the top of the mountain is the gold standard. And falling short of that is the lesson. You know, having that absolute metric to compare yourself, that's what gives value to the methods you come up with, the things you learn, how to consistently move yourself up. So the people that, you know, get distracted and start walking laterally around the mountain, hey, that's great, you enjoy going for a walk, but that's different than the climb. So I resent people that try to conflate the two or suggest that somehow you're being a dickhead if you suggest they're not the same thing. So where does that leave you in your training? I've come across a lot of people that aren't actually powerlifters. They like to train recreationally. They enjoy the process of lifting and getting stronger and, you know, seeing the fruits of their labors, but they don't really have a desire to compete, yet they will still pull sumo. And the number one reason I hear as to why they do that is because they think, often mistakenly, that they have some limitation that keeps them from pulling conventional. But for the most part, it's that they feel more comfortable sumo. Of course you feel more comfortable sumo. Pulling weight in this setup, if you can actually get in this setup, it's less range of motion. You start out more optimized. And initially, assuming that your leverages don't really disqualify you from the setup, initially you're gonna find that you can move more weight. So if that's the case, what does that say about your training approach? It says that you are resisting things that are harder, that are more uncomfortable. And those tend to be the things that actually set you up for success. Those tend to be the things that develop you in a more well-rounded way. So if your training consists of a lot of pressing and squatting and sumo deadlifts, you're missing out on this huge factor, which is training your hinge, training yourself to get comfortable, pitched forward under a bunch of weight and extending your hips through under that load. That is a distinctly unique stimulus that will build up your midsection, your upper back, and your hips in a way that all of those squatting specific type exercises absolutely will not. So my overarching advice is that if you're not even interested in powerlifting, you shouldn't be pulling sumo unless you know that you're using it as a secondary glute development exercise. But that shouldn't be your main lift because it's not a good developmental exercise. For those of you that do powerlift, if you're built for sumo and this is how you pull more weight, if you know your leverages are lined up great for sumo, I'm not going to tell you to get on a soapbox and pull conventional anyways out of some misguided sense of trying to uphold the spirit of the sport. It's your job to do everything you can to win, and I suggest you do that. But you should also do everything in your power to stay as well-rounded as you can, and that's going to involve, no matter how you're built, a healthy heaping of conventional deads. Conventional deads win as a feat of strength, but no matter who you are, they also win as a developmental exercise. If you are advantaged on the platform sumo, that means that you're not disadvantaged, which means as a developmental exercise, it's going to fall short. So your best bet, no matter how you're built, is to have a foundation of conventional pulls, and that can be any mix of deficit pulls, regular pulls, block pulls, Romanians. No matter who you are, Romanians. If you got an illness, Romanians will cure it. I got a fever, and the only cure, it's more Romanians. Romanians are fantastic. Everybody should be doing them. So that's my spiel on sumo. I'm not going to go so far to say I hate sumo, but I usually roll my eyes every time I see somebody pull a world record that moves 4 inches off the ground. But it's up to the individual to define what inspires them and what compels them to move. I think so many of us have objectively gotten into powerlifting because we like the idea of strength and what being strong means. The longer you spend in this sport becoming a specialist, if you do any other physical activity at all, you're going to see that gap as you become a strength specialist, how actually it stops giving return to other activities. And the more you go down the rabbit hole of finding little technical shortcuts to try and give you these little leverage advantages on the platform, you're going to lose more and more of what it means to be strong. Now, for some of you, that's okay. If all you care about is getting that plastic gold medal trophy, that's fine. I love the idea of being strong because it says about what I can do, which is why I do strongman, where we're constantly doing shit that we suck at. You can have a 900-pound deadlift and be a garbage stone loader. No matter what you do, you're going to go to a contest and you're going to be humbled. And I like the idea of those weaknesses being exposed. Now, it's kind of a chicken or the egg scenario, but having those weaknesses exposed actually is what develops you further. Every time we do an accessory exercise to try and bring up a weakness, what are we doing? we're disadvantaging ourselves. We're putting ourselves in a position where we are weaker, where we are not comfortable, where we go through more range of motion, or otherwise in a shitty leverage position. And that is what causes you to adapt and grow. So the more time you spend jerking off with your best possible leverages, the more specific and specialized you will get to that, but you will develop weaknesses and you will not be able to apply that strength in as broad of an area as you would like to think. We're all here to have fun and to train and to grow, but I just hope that you don't mistake lateral movement around the mountain as vertical distance, because they're two different things, all right? Go ahead and leave your hate mail in the comments. Better yet, go ahead and leave it in the forum, empire-forum.com. I'm sure we can get 1,000 comments on a thread about sumo deadlifting and why you think it's great or why you absolutely hate it. So if you have any questions, leave them. I'll get back to it. Thanks for watching, guys. Until next time, it's Bromley at Empire Barbell. I'll see you.